The finale for Season 4 of Joss Whedon's Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a slower-paced outro. After defeating the robot-demon hybrid Adam, the Scoobies sit down to a movie and popcorn where they quickly fall asleep from all the excitement. The episode takes a trip, then, through each individual's dreamscape, where the central characters are picked apart and explored through a surreal tone poem, as Joss himself described it. It's a weirdly wonderful, truthful, dark and foreshadowy, oftentimes very funny addition to a season full of unique episodes. But after the, shall we say, boss battle that came before it, Restless was a strange change of pace and made for an even stranger finale. But why am I talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer in a video about Life is Strange? Well, besides the obvious, it's a great show. Similarly, a large chunk of Life is Strange's fifth and final episode, Polarized, in comparison to the episode that preceded it, metaphorically switches the track. To me, it is in part the Restless of Life is Strange's season. I say this because one chapter in particular really breaks down the character of Max Caulfield, the main protagonist, by offering us a trip into her psyche, her inner monologue through a nightmare sequence. During this segment, the core plot almost plays second fiddle for a substantial length of time in the episode. Not only is this interesting, but the way in which Don't Nod try and portray their own tone poem is something we haven't yet seen, at least to my knowledge, in a game such as this, an adventure series, where your choices matter. This change of pace worked as well, as players were beginning to suspect, I think, where the plot might have been going already by the end of the season. There are only so many scenarios you can witness before cluing into Chloe's role in the grand scheme of things. What you say? So instead of choosing to surprise players with a revelation they may or may not have been expecting, the episode strips back the layers of plot and circumstance down to our main girl, and that offers some entirely new surprises and themes you could continue to debate, really, long after the game is done. There are three sequences in particular that stood out to me as particularly special, the first being the recycled Jefferson dialogue. What perhaps impresses me most about how this nightmare starts is that it's the very same conversation players will recognise that we had before in class in Chrysalis, the first episode. Only this time, everything is different. This time, the conversation is playing out honestly, or at least without any veneer. Both Jefferson and Max are voicing their inner, perhaps even repressed, thoughts, feelings, fears, and hidden agendas. Each choice represents something of the person saying it. Max and the player can choose to tell the psychopath Jefferson that she loves him, for example, representing a possible crush she may have harboured towards him before episode 4. Our dark room is another option, implying, to me at least, her possible reverence for Jefferson's artistic talent, and wish to take part in it when she was naive to his true personality, maybe even now, still. Even more extreme answers like "thank you for killing Chloe," suggesting that deep down some small part of Max might feel things would be easier without her, and "shit selfie," representing her self-doubt and insecurities about her skills or abilities as an artist. Remember how she felt so weird at the Zeitgeist Gallery event showcasing her own work, like a little kid hanging out with the adults, she said. All these provide a direct link to not necessarily Max's truest feelings, but perhaps the darkest thoughts she has about herself and others. Maybe she did admire Jefferson, something one could easily feel guilty about, all things considered. Maybe she simply fears what her feelings may have been. Likewise, perhaps Max is simply scared that she might see Chloe as a burden, who knows? But all the dialogue choices offer unique introspection and a chance to question how Max truly sees herself, what she really thinks about behind that cautious exterior. This leads me to a similar sort of sequence, Chloe in the dark room, and another particularly impressive one. Only this really seems to act as a commentary on Max's insecurities and confusions regarding her growing sexuality. Here, she sits in a chair in her pyjamas, perhaps her most vulnerable attire, seen in the morning dormitory chapter of episode 2. Watching, or perhaps witnessing, as Jefferson, Nathan, Warren, and even Victoria lust after Chloe, the wild, exciting, and confident one. Chloe, by contrast, takes on a cruel, malicious attitude here, scrutinizing and accusing Max for being a child, useless. And I don't think it's an accident that this all takes place in the dark room, the place which has transformed many female students into victims, a place where you're alone, afraid, and unsafe. That she is a passenger to this event implies so many things. Her perceived inadequacies and insecurities about her inhibitions, lack of popularity or looks, even jealousy, both romantic and otherwise. It's quite bold, really, but the most impressive thing about it, to my mind, is that it manages to slot into any and all of the potential players' experience. Whether or not you romance Chloe or Warren, Max's story is laced in sexual confusion from the beginning, and so any outcomes you glean from this realistically feed into this segment, which is really smart writing and setup. That it's just vague enough to be applicable to any player path, but also specific enough that people can read their own experiences of the game into it. That said, this can be said for both the Jefferson dialogue and the Chloe sequence in the darkroom. The third and final part that really captured my attention was being hunted down in the high school, for what it, again, might imply. This part of the nightmare sees Max attempt to escape Jefferson first and others later, in a dreamy amalgam of the Zeitgeist Gallery, school, and junkyard, all places, I want to note, that either have negative memories attached or are high-pressure environments. Perhaps the most telling part of this sequence is that all of the people the player must dodge are the men in Max's life, young and old, friends and enemies, barring her own father, and this is really interesting, because clearly not all of the male characters in this game are bad or inherently evil, yet a large number of them prove themselves either morally ambiguous, untrustworthy, or downright unstable. Nathan, David, and Jefferson, for example, rightly or wrongly appear to abuse their positions to threaten and oftentimes harm those around them. Principal Wells, the supposed moral centre of the school, on occasion seems less interested in the students' well-being and more on his struggles with alcohol and shady dealings with the Prescott family. Notice how Principal Wells' eyes in the nightmare scan the environment like searchlights. He's watching out for you, but in a way that ties nicely into the theme of surveillance, which runs throughout the game, literally and metaphorically through photo media, and a previous scene where he practically interrogates Max after Kate throws herself or attempts to from the school's roof. Frank, as well, is unstable on many levels, though I suppose he mainly endangers the students of Blackwell by supplying drugs, the extent of which only really comes out in episode 4. If parts of this nightmare really do expose some of Max's subconscious thoughts and feelings, it could explain how the acts of Jefferson, David, etc. have perhaps sown the smallest seeds of fear and distrust concerning other potentially more positive or non-threatening male figures in her life like Warren and Samuel, who also, I feel it important to note, appear. I mentioned it briefly before, but the rest of this nightmare places Max in a spectator role. Something not unique to this sequence in particular, or genre of video game. Players literally walk about and interact with a relatively static world via button prompts in adventure games. But here, it actually acts as a commentary of the main playable character. Here, the physical act of play within the adventure game or genre says, Max feels like a passenger in her own life. Despite the incredible power she wields and her growing confidence, she sees herself as a wallflower, and it's entirely possible that she always will. All of the aforementioned elements pose questions, might make you wonder about Max as a character outside of the confines and limitations of the game space. This doesn't just make for a good narrative experience, it's breaking outside of the medium itself, through character-driven narrative, something select games have done before, but largely seem to struggle with, even if narrative is the supposed focus. And it does all of this, I think, by manipulating the very genre itself, much like the rest of the gameplay does, through themes of photography and time. But no clearer is all this than in the Nightmare sequence. Like Restless, the Nightmare in Polarized is a fascinating ender, in part to an equally intriguing series, because it rather courageously slows the pace down, in an episode high in action and interaction, to take the video game equivalent of a leisurely stroll. Moreover, it asks some not just interesting, but harsh questions of our protagonist Max Caulfield, a character that up till the end was simply the quiet, good girl. It isn't often that we get to see the flaws or potentially unattractive qualities in our video game protagonists, not that it's always necessary, but in Polarized's nightmare sequence, that is exactly the kind of information we become privy to. As I said before, and unlike Restless of course, Don't Nod the studio managed to do all of the above, not just through cutscenes, but by harnessing the choice elements and manipulating the player experience within their own imaginations and within rule-based play. And that's such a clever, not to mention forward-thinking move on the studio's part, and an effective one too. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this short video on some of my thoughts concerning the nightmare sequence. Feel free to share your thoughts and comments about Life is Strange here, on my Facebook page, or on Twitter, the links to which are down below. I try to read and respond to as many comments as I can. I will see you all soon.